Or maybe you'll say, oh, that's too cute, and then I'll feel, okay, good. I'm not taking it. Find it. Oh, I don't know.
Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howard.
Yeah, sure.
We are talking about last night's Democratic primary debate where basic income really had a moment. So that's pretty exciting for us because we've been talking about every one of these debates, and this one is perhaps the most relevant to us. So I've selected a few clips. We're actually going to watch some segments, kind of large chunks the whole way through, and we'll stop after each person speaks.
Okay. Mitchell is saying that maybe the voice channel isn't working.
Oh, and that's frozen.
That's supposed to be frozen.
Oh.
I'm not sure if that's still true or if that was from a little while ago.
Yeah, hold on. Is that one working? USB. Okay. All right. Can you guys hear me okay now?
People on the live stream?
Oh, no, he's saying, well, I actually did have an audio problem. He was talking about something else.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
It just as a coincidence, one of the microphones wasn't working and I happened to fix it.
Nice.
So now we should be good. Everyone should be able to hear us. We're talking about the Democratic debate from last night. And there's a lot of content on there about basic income. So we are going to start. We're going to start with a clip from the debate. You guys ready?
More like ethereal.
Yes.
Hey, come on.
Sorry. Yeah, we're ready.
32:0. Okay, let's see if this works.
You say your federal jobs guarantee is part of the answer to the threat from automation, but tens of millions of Americans could end up losing their jobs. Are you promising that you will have a job for every single one of those Americans?
Damn right we will. And I'll tell you why. If you look at what goes on in America today, we have an infrastructure which is collapsing. We can put 15 million people to work rebuilding our roads, our bridges, our water systems, our wastewater plants, airports, etc. Furthermore, and I hope we will discuss it at length tonight, this planet faces the greatest threat in its history from climate change. And the Green New Deal that I have advocated will create up to 20 million jobs as we move away from fossil fuel to energy efficiency and sustainable energy. We need workers to do childcare. We need workers, great teachers, to come in to school systems which don't have the teachers that we need right now. We need more doctors. We need more dentists. We need more carpenters. We need more sheet metal workers. And when we talk about making public colleges and universities tuition-free and canceling student debt, we're going to give those people the opportunity to get those good jobs.
Okay, what do we think about that? Yeah.
Oh man. Well, I like your answer to this.
Yeah.
So he brings up climate change, for example. And to the degree that you're doing these things to make jobs, you're likely to make too many jobs or to do them inefficiently, which isn't good for climate change, which wastes people's time. So I don't think anybody had that answer, but that's kind of my response to it.
Yeah, Richard.
But
go ahead.
I have to admit that politically, as we've talked about, it can be hard to get some of these things done, like the infrastructure, without the carrot of jobs. So I recognize that there could be some kind of political reason to be emphasizing that. But otherwise, it kind of just seems like he's lumping a lot of things together that he wants to have happen. For example, the education isn't necessary for many of the jobs that he listed. So there also wasn't like a lot of logical coherence in what he was talking about.
Yeah, so I mean, I think he's right about a few things. Like you were saying, there's lots of infrastructure work that needs doing, and we should pay to have that done. That's absolutely right. And he's also right that we can promise a job for every American. That's something that's possible. We can do that. The question is, do we want to?
Right.
And I think naturally, as a side effect of doing the things we want to do anyway, there's going to be some labor that we're going to be using, and that's fine. That's not a bad thing. When it starts to be a bad thing is when we start doing it for the jobs, like we're doing it for the workers. To the extent that we're creating jobs to push money to workers, we're not doing it because there's actually work that needs doing. If we're doing it for that reason. Now, like Bethany said, sometimes there's work that needs doing, and the only way you can convince people to do it is that there are people who don't have jobs who need jobs, and then you can kind of, like Bethany was saying, you can use that as a carrot. So that's fine, and that's, you know, the outcome is kind of what we want there, but, you know, it can quickly shift into the outcome being not what we want, because it just ends up being what we want almost by coincidence. So yeah, a job guarantee is possible. And when he talks about implementing a job guarantee in response to automation, I think something he's not acknowledging is that this is what we always do. We use economic policy to create jobs for people in response to labor-saving technology. I was at a book talk last night. There's this guy, Andrew McAfee, and he wrote The Second Machine Age. No, that's...
Oh, yeah.
That is a different guy. No, that guy's crazy. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he killed his neighbor or something like that. It's from America.
Yeah. Yeah, he's also really into Bitcoin and that kind of stuff. Yeah. But Andrew McAfee, he just came out with a new book called More from Less, and it's about how we're producing more stuff using fewer resources, which is generally true across a lot of the different resources that we use in our economy. It's not true for labor. So I asked him, I said, you know, after his talk, I said, you know, labor is a resource. To what extent are we producing more from less labor? And how do we maximize the amount of stuff we produce while minimizing the amount of labor we need? And he gave the answer that I expected, which is that, well, if you look at the trends, you look at the data, labor is actually not falling off in resource usage, unlike these other things, these like steel and other materials and stuff like that. And he didn't have an answer for when it would start falling off. So he was just kind of estimating sometime in the mid-21st century or something like that.
Labor would fall off, meaning numbers of workers?
Meaning we'd be using less total
workers?
man-hours.
Okay.
Like
Yeah.
we were talking about last
Yeah.
time. Yeah.
Yeah. So he didn't have an answer. He was kind of stumped. He's like, I don't know why it hasn't fallen off yet, but it probably will soon, that kind of thing. Well, the reason why it hasn't fallen off yet is because of stuff like this. We haven't had a federal jobs guarantee before, but we've had other programs and other, you know, government policies that create more work for people to do.
During the Depression, we had the Works Progress Administration.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we've talked about that, and that was talked about during the 2016 campaign, you know, to do the infrastructure. That was talked about with Obama. It's always coming back.
Yeah.
And yet, it's not really, they don't really examine that assumption.
Yeah.
The other thing about this is that he's not examining his assumption that this is the way to get people money.
Right.
That it's got to be about jobs. He
Yeah.
just been so narrowly focused on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he doesn't really explain why it's better than a basic income. I mean, I guess
Right.
he would talk
Although
about
he's
cost
not even
and stuff.
entertaining that idea.
I mean, his argument for why it's better than a basic income is that there's plenty of work that needs doing, and if you're paying people a basic income, you're not paying them to do that work.
Right.
Is that what he says?
That's what he says, yeah.
Oh.
That's what he
And
generally
you could
says,
argue,
yeah.
like, if you're worried about cost, you can say that it's a lot cheaper to just create the jobs as needed than to give everybody a basic income.
Yep, and people do say
Actually,
that,
it's
yeah.
not
Go ahead,
very
Richard.
cost effective to create those jobs because, well, for example, on Real Time last Friday, he was like quoting that it takes $200 million per mile of high-speed rail in California, while in France it's $13 million for the same mile.
Wow.
There were like what was it? They created 6,000 homes right after World War II in Los Angeles for $16 million, and today each apartment costs. They quoted it should be $200,000 per each month, but it's $500 and something or other $1,000 for a little apartment for the homeless.
Right. So you're saying it gets inefficient when you're trying to create jobs at the same time?
Mm-hmm.
The costs?
And all the corruption,
Right.
and like we need consultants for this thing, so even though people should know what they're doing.
We were just watching the bike lane get painted.
Oh yeah,
9, 10
what?
people's
the
full-time
bike
work.
lane. So they paint the
I
bike lanes in
cannot,
the road. They
it's
paint them green.
Right.
So they were doing that last night.
Yeah, and it
Yeah.
was taking, I counted, there were 10 people full-time,
Oh, yeah.
and they were going very slowly.
Oh, yeah.
It's impossible that would be needed.
And there's actually
I'm sure some of them
But
need to like watch for
I gotta
cars
say
and
that
stuff, but
bike lane came out really well.
it does look really nice, but in terms
Yeah.
of this point about like how many jobs do you really need, and are
Right.
you resisting using automation to
Oh,
do
but
it?
there's a-
So
Like-
that's the old gold bricking thing.
right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Construction workers, I mean, there's
Totally.
always too many, somebody to oversee, somebody to tell people what to do, you know,
Right.
Well, we're-
manager, sub-manager.
We're kind of gold bricking as a society.
Right, that's
Yeah.
the point. And do you
Yeah.
want the government like gold,
Right.
having an
Well,
incentive to
creating
create
more
all
of
these
it.
jobs?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's
exactly.
actually a robot can paint lines already.
I'm sure they can. That's what I mean. And then
Yeah.
these people are not
Yeah.
only wasting their time; they're inhaling some fumes that did not
Yeah.
seem very healthy.
Right.
So there's costs to the individuals too. It's not like it's well. Anyway,
Yeah.
Yeah.
speaking to the choir here, but
So Mitchell says. So Mitchell says there's still an echo, but whatever you did earlier changed it, but it's still noticeable.
okay.
I'm probably not going to try to mess with it unless it's really bad. So let me know if it's really bad. Tommy says the threat from automation sounds like the debate questioners have accepted the idea of automation as a threat to jobs. That's progress. Yeah. Yeah, I think that is progress to some extent, like recognizing the power of automation and how much labor that can save. But they've still got a long way to go because they're still thinking of it as a threat. They're thinking of it as a bad thing, as some crisis that we need to respond to. And maybe it is in some sense, but it's always kind of been with us, and we've always kind of responded in the wrong way. And when you look at people like Bernie Sanders, it's like, oh my God, we're going to keep responding to it in the wrong way. So we need to do this right, because the less work we have to do, the better.
And yet he's a progressive.
And yet he's a progressive. What do you mean?
Well, I mean, that's what his label is.
His label, yeah, I mean, he's a progressive, he's a democratic socialist. But you got to understand that people on the left, what it means to be a leftist in terms of the identity of leftism,
Yeah.
is that you're very much labor oriented. Yeah,
Right.
tied into labor.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Especially in his camp.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's true, for Elizabeth Warren. It's true kind of for everyone standing up there. It's even a little bit true for Andrew Yang, right? Andrew Yang talks about workers and jobs and that kind of thing.
Right.
And even Andrew Yang frames this as like an existential threat. It's not like, now we have an opportunity to do less work.
Right.
right.
If only we could pay people using a basic income, we wouldn't have to force people to work as much. That's not how he frames it.
Right.
Right.
Maybe you'll get to this, but Tulsi Gabbard said something about giving people the opportunity to discover what they really wanted to do instead of work at one point, which I wondered if you caught that.
Oh yeah, I don't know if I have that as one of the quotes, but that's a great thing. I mean, like,
The only one that said it.
yeah, I mean, like, there's work. I mean, we spend our time in ways that are valuable to us. So most work is not paid, and like in an efficient labor market, the only thing you're using the labor market for is to get people to do something different than what they'd ordinarily do.
Yeah.
So maybe you need to build infrastructure. So that would require you to get at least some people to do something different than what they would ordinarily do. But when you're thinking about it from the perspective of workers deserve jobs,
Right.
then you have it backwards a little bit.
Yeah.
So I think Bernie Sanders makes a mistake here, where he's saying everybody deserves a job, and we're going to ensure that they have it. And he's also saying, on the other hand, that work is valuable. It's always contributing. Like, he believes that kind of in his core. But those two things are contradictory. If you're making up work to give people money, then by definition, you're not doing it because it's useful work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that also just shades into making up work to give people meaning too. I mean, it's not just about the money, and that's another whole discussion. But I think it's underlying a lot of it. It's underlying a lot of philosophies in politics.
Yeah.
The job isn't just a job.
Yeah.
It's more than a job. And when you say, give people the freedom to do, or pay them for things they wouldn't ordinarily do, to be doing something else, what if they're doing nothing else? Then people say, well, then at least they're doing something, and they're getting money for it.
Right. but really, what is nothing? Can you ever say that someone's human existence is nothing, right? So it's really kind of, it comes back to like some moral judgment about what work is useful and what work isn't and stuff like that. And plenty of the most impactful work and innovations that came from humanity, were born of work that nobody ever would have thought to pay for.
Of course.
Right. So if you force everyone to have a job in what society deems as useful work, then you're stifling all that human potential.
Right.
Yeah.
And creativity comes from nothing. Let's
Yeah.
face it. You have to be pretty bored first.
Yeah.
You have to get into that mood.
Yeah. And Tommy says shorter work week, lower employment, etc. I think it's important to recognize that when we want a certain amount of labor in the economy, that's not about looking at each individual person and saying that person needs to contribute X amount. Like every person needs to contribute a 4-day work week or something like that. If we just let supply and demand work, what you're going to see is you're going to see some people working 100-hour weeks, some people working 40-hour weeks, some people working not at all, and that's perfectly okay because people are working the amount that the market is incentivizing them to do. You might have some arguments for maybe some of these jobs could be done for fewer hours, and maybe you want to put some restrictions in place, that kind of thing. But by and large, it's not about expecting everyone to contribute the same amount. It's expecting in aggregate the right amount of work is being done to support the output that we need in the economy. So I'm not a fan of like shorter work week, fewer hours type policies, that kind of thing. But I do agree. I don't. So Tommy says next, we need to start moving toward full unemployment instead of full employment, right? I don't think there's ever going to be such a thing as full unemployment. People are always going to have reasons to pay each other to do things other than what they would ordinarily do. So there's always going to be jobs, and that's okay. What we need to be moving towards is getting to the optimal level of employment, such that it's not the case that people aren't working enough, but it's also not the case that we're making people do useless work as an excuse to pay them. And there's kind of an optimal there.
Optimal free ridership.
Optimal free ridership. Yeah, if you guys have seen the free rider discussion, we talked about this because a lot of times in our society we're worried about people free riding on the benefits provided by the economy, that kind of thing, and how do you prevent that? But there's also that's a free rider problem, but then we talked about, a free rider opportunity where there's an opportunity for people to get more than what they're putting in or to get benefits that we can afford to give them. And we certainly don't want to take that away either. We want to ensure that the economy can provide for as much as possible for people with the minimum amount of labor in aggregate. So individual people might just be coasting around, or some of them might be working really hard, and all of that is okay. Yeah. So Tommy says, we'll get to another clip in a second. Tommy says, I'm interested by your story about painting the bike lane. As UBI activists, we are condoning the idea that people should be allowed to spend their time inefficiently if we can afford it. Well,
Yeah, I want to respond to that.
yeah, go ahead, because I think you're going to say what I'm going to
I think
say.
in a way that's right, but I think we wouldn't want to force them to spend their time inefficiently, i.e. require that they get their money that way.
X number of hours on the job.
Right.
No matter whether there's
Yeah,
something
exactly.
to do or not.
Exactly.
That's horrible.
Right. And we wouldn't want to pay directly as the government for them to spend their time inefficiently rather than just maybe paying them the money. So
Right.
with my example, those people, if they were just in their spare time, they all wanted to get together as friends and somewhat inefficiently paint a bike lane as volunteers, that would be fine with me because they're getting to make that choice.
How do you know they didn't do that?
The base rate probabilities, I guess.
Yeah.
They had They had a pretty official looking uniform, so maybe they made those as a group of friends. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe they just really enjoyed the paint fumes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think that's the difference. And also if you force people to work inefficiently, then you're not allowing them to find something that maybe is unpaid but useful or at least more fun for them than what they're doing otherwise.
Yeah, and I would also question what we mean when we say inefficiently.
Mm-hmm.
Inefficient with respect to what? What are we optimizing for? If we're optimizing for human prosperity, then letting people sit around is, maximizing that is, what's most efficient,
Mm-hmm.
right? So the question is what are we optimizing for? And I think oftentimes we're thinking in terms of at a very small scale, what is an individual worker contributing to the endeavor, or does a person have a job that they're being paid to do, and like how efficient is that for the output of that particular thing? And I mean, yeah.
I think Tommy's on the same page.
Yeah.
She just,
Yeah, so Tommy says the dystopian part is that we should let people have freedom to do that inefficient stuff, so that that they want to do, instead of only approved inefficiencies like the bike lane painting.
Yeah.
Right, like it's the difference between forcing people to spend their time doing something that has no benefit to society versus allowing them to spend their time in a way that has no benefit to society,
Right.
potentially, but has benefit to them,
Right.
that they feel good about.
Well, and also
Yeah.
time itself is a commodity. I mean, having to go to an office job, for example, when there's really nothing to do.
right.
You're really resentful, not about, I mean, and people make a big deal about, well, I didn't do anything all day, kind of like I'm getting away with stuff.
Mhm.
But everybody's angry because they have to give up their time.
Right.
That's so precious,
Yeah.
that you have 8 hours that you're giving to
Mhm.
somebody else to do with as they will. And if there's nothing to do, it's even worse. I
Right.
think. You get bitter.
Yeah.
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 All right. Anyone have any more comments before we move on to
I
the
want to
next
get
clip?
to the next clip. I bet there's
Yeah.
a lot of clips.
There's a lot of clips. We're not going to get through all the clips.
Okay.
Senator Sanders, thank you. Mr. Yang, your main solution to job loss from automation is a universal basic income. Why is giving people $1,000 a month better than Sanders' plan to guaranteeing them a job?
I am for the spirit of a federal jobs guarantee, but you have to look at how it would actually materialize in practice. What are the jobs? Who manages you? What if you don't like your job? What if you're not good at your job? The fact is, most Americans do not want to work for the federal government. And saying that that is the vision of the economy of the 21st century, to me, is not a vision that most Americans would embrace. Also, Senator Sanders' description of a federal jobs guarantee does not take into account the work of people like my wife, who's at home with our 2 boys, one of whom is autistic. We have a freedom dividend of $1,000 a month. It actually recognizes the work that is happening in our families and our communities. It helps all Americans transition. Because the fact is, and you know this in Ohio, if you rely upon the federal government to target its resources, you wind up with failed retraining programs and jobs that no one wants. When we put the money into our hands, we can build a trickle-up economy. From our people, our families, and our communities up, it will enable us to do the kind of work that we want to do. This is the sort of positive vision in response to the 4th Industrial Revolution that we have to embrace as a party.
Senator Book.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't like the way he's using the term trickle-up economy.
Neither does Bernie. Because that's his thing, the grassroots revolution.
Grassroots is different than trickle-up.
Yeah.
I mean, Andrew Yang is talking about you give people the money and then the economy kind of trickles up from there. I mean, part of the reason I don't like this term is because I was using this term before he was, and I was using it to mean something different.
Oh.
Now he stole your turn.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the economy is always a trickle-up economy in the sense that consumers spend their money, and then that money goes to the producers, and then Amazon ends up with it, and
Right.
what?
But then it's
Well, I don't think it's a trickle. I have a problem with the term. I think I said this before.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's just semantics.
Yeah.
I feel like it's the same idea that you have though, because it's like the idea is that if there's more money at the bottom, then there's more production. That seems like it's the idea that he's likely to give people who aren't used to thinking about it.
If
like
he
this.
said we have to acknowledge that we don't live in a trickle-down economy, we live in a trickle-up economy, and we have to fund that economy using a basic income,
Okay.
then I would be happy with
Okay,
that.
I understand why you would say that,
Yeah.
but I think I would actually be more confusing for most
Yeah.
people listening.
Yeah.
They haven't really thought about any of these concepts, and so
Yeah.
I think he's giving people the right idea,
I do too.
which is that more production, more good stuff is going to happen if you give people money to spend.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Whereas your point, usually I like the way you phrase things more, even like if you're on that stage. But in this case, it seems like there's too many concepts at once that people are trying to wrap their head around. And nobody up there is saying that they should do trickle down.
Everybody
economics
gets
anyway.
trickle down, so now.
Right,
they
exactly.
kinda
You're
get trickle
scaffolding
up.
on
Yeah.
top.
No, but I mean, it's easier to scaffold on top of that if you're actually talking about the same thing. If you're saying money doesn't trickle down, the trickle down economics doesn't work.
Well-
The real economics is that it trickles up, not
Nobody
down.
up there is
Point of
talking
view,
about
though.
trickle down economics. Nobody wants that up there on that stage. So that's
No.
you don't need to
It's a
fight that.
Republican thing.
I'm talking about like he's drawing the contrast between the two. it's easier to draw the contrast between the two if the trickle up concept is literally the reverse of the
I know,
trickle
but
down
the problem I
concept.
have with your point is that you have
Yeah.
to think about the economy being trickle up, and then you have to think
Yeah.
about funding it. So it's two concepts instead of
Yeah.
one, and
Too
it's just
complicated.
it's too fast a soundbite to
Yeah.
get people to understand both of those things at
Practically,
once.
she's right.
Yeah,
And I think he gets to the point with
Yeah.
one concept.
I agree.
yeah.
He's smoothing over a lot of things.
He's smoothing over a
Yeah.
lot of things. For example, I would never say I'm for the spirit of a jobs guarantee.
Right.
I'm totally against the
Somebody
spirit
said,
of a
"Who
jobs
was it?
guarantee.
On the
Yeah.
live stream, I am for the spirit.
Yeah, Bernie looked hopeful.
Yeah.
And then he didn't.
Yeah.
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 Then he was
Uh,
mad. Oh boy. But yeah, I mean, I don't
The
know.
reason
That
why he
wasn't.
says I'm for the spirit is because he's trying to cater to
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders supporters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And not be, he's trying not to be confrontational, actually.
Right, which I kind of like.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's
I guess-
his personality.
I guess I feel like the main problem I have with this is that he doesn't mention wasting time, wasting resources by essentially making up jobs.
Yeah.
He talks about what might be more resonant for people, which is like the concrete idea of not wanting to work for the government.
Yeah,
But
because
that's
you
more
waste time.
controversial too. Someone can come back and say, no, these jobs are going to be good. People are going to like them.
Right.
Employees who work for the government are happy. Like
Right.
it's
Right.
a controversial point that could be wrong. Whereas
Yeah.
the point about wasting resources and
Yeah.
wasting people's time is more of a theoretically solid
Although a
point.
lot of people think government jobs are a waste of time, so at least kind of
Right, so if you
on firm
already think
ground
that,
there.
You'll
Right.
agree with him, but it
Right.
opens
There are
them up
some
to.
people- a lot of people want government jobs because they're secure.
Right, exactly.
But
Yeah.
that doesn't mean they're fulfilling
Right.
or they have anything to do with them.
Exactly.
you know?
Yeah, and it doesn't mean the what's being produced by that labor is actually
Right. And
Useful,
people have
yeah.
a sense for inefficiency, for government inefficiency.
Yeah.
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 Which so it's probably politically smart that he brought that up. But again, it's not. I wish he had also brought up the more rock solid point
Yeah.
that like
Yeah.
if you're doing it to make up work, like
Yeah.
you're going to be making up work for people inevitably. Your whole incentive will be to have the least efficient jobs possible. And is that really what we want?
Right.
But you know what, I'm just thinking, there are people who would disagree strongly that their work was made up, even if it is made up. Because
Yeah.
the whole point of this made-up work is to also give people the idea that they're doing something
Right,
important or
right.
useful.
Yeah.
And that's made up. And if they're living the whole lie, then they're
Exactly.
not even gonna know that they're wasting their time.
Right.
Yeah. Some people are definitely living the lie, and they'll find out they're wasting their time when we eliminate that job. When we have a basic income and we can,
God.
Yeah.
allow the labor market to be efficient.
But again, there's such an underappreciation
Yeah.
of people's time in this
Yes.
discussion. Like people's time isn't worth anything.
Yeah.
Like what they really want is, like you said, to have to go report to a job 8 hours a day, not spend time with their kids or do something they're more interested in.
Yeah.
It just doesn't really make sense. It's really bizarre. Nobody, even Yang doesn't emphasize it as much as I would like.
Well, I mean, he
But-
says, that the federal jobs guarantee doesn't recognize the work that his
Right.
wife does.
And that's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I guess I wish he emphasized it more. And
Yeah.
like you said, the positives of being able to automate.
And I wish he framed it a little bit differently, because I think it's less about recognizing the work that his wife does, and more about recognizing that humans spend their time in valuable ways.
Exactly.
Because you're not.
That's a good example, though. And people can relate to that.
I don't like the idea of framing basic income as paying his wife to do that work.
It's kind of ambiguous.
Recognizing it, but it would enable it.
Right.
It would
exactly.
enable
Enable people
Right.
to do that if that's
Right.
a good choice for
Can
them.
Yeah.
extrapolate from that better than say paying you to go and do paintings or.
Oh, I think it's.
Who wanna do that?
I think I wouldn't say paying people to do paintings either. I wouldn't say paying people to do anything. But
Right.
and I do think this is
Allowing.
right, and I do think this is a good example. But I would probably if I were him, I would say, the federal jobs guarantee doesn't recognize that people naturally spend their time in valuable ways that we couldn't predict and never would have thought to pay for. It enables people to do,
Things like my wife does. which
things
is
like
stay
my
home
wife
with her
does at
kids.
home. Yeah.
Right.
So less about like paying her to do that.
I know.
Yeah.
The most radical thing you could say has to do with paying people just to be alive. That they
Yeah.
deserve to be able to eat and have a place to live. That would be very radical. I don't think that
Yeah.
they'd be able to do that.
Then I start to have problems with that too, because for me it's less about deserving specific things, and it's more about I like the part about paying people to be alive, and I like the part about or how I would frame it is that we want to maximize human prosperity. So we want to give people as much as possible. It's not about kind of enumerating the various basic things that we want people to have. It's about
Yeah.
we want to maximize humanity. Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel a little bit like you're arguing against a pessimistic version of the jobs guarantee.
Oh yeah.
I think that you're kind of assuming that it's going to be, that the objectives that the jobs are created to achieve wouldn't be worth achieving, for one, and that it would be done in a really inefficient way. I mean, it seems to me that there is a more. I mean, I still think it's wouldn't be as good as a basic income, but it might not be as bad as you're making out. I mean, if it's definitely a different path, and it does give people less freedom, but maybe as a country we could agree on a bunch of labor-intensive things that we would benefit if we achieved. I mean, if we.
I think we could end up better off than we are now, like with neither one. So I guess I don't mean to be like so pessimistic about it. But I guess what I worry about is like it does create the incentive to be inefficient. And so even if people are trying not to be on some level, then like you want to be creating as many jobs as possible, especially if we have a lot of excess labor. So you might resist automating. You might like have more people doing it than needed. And it doesn't mean the objectives aren't good, but they might be done less efficiently than they need to be. And maybe that's only a little bit less efficiently, and maybe it's like a lot less efficiently.
Right.
We don't really know like where on that spectrum it's going to be. It could be that it's only a tiny bit of inefficiency, or it could be that it's a lot.
And even if you imagine that you get really lucky and everything is perfectly efficient with a jobs guarantee and all these jobs are at their,
Right.
optimal levels, and you've figured out, you've redefined labor to be all these things that, would be the most valuable things to do. Like, I don't think this is realistic, but even if we imagine that we've done all of that,
Right.
you're still doing the jobs guarantee for the wrong reason. You're doing it for the worker instead of doing it for the output.
And like,
so this is what kind
a couple of things with that. Like one, this is what we talked about a long time ago with like how markets can solve problems that are more complex than individuals or governments can solve. Like it'd be very hard to figure that out in a top-down way.
Yeah.
How to allocate labor in the most efficient way to all these different jobs. So that's sort of one problem.
Right.
And then the other problem is like even if that were true at a moment in time, as automation changes, as the amount of people changes, whatever, how could it possibly be efficient at the next phase of time? Like it just seems impossible that you can have both goals met, like efficient allocation of labor and jobs guarantee.
I'll tell you how you can have an efficient jobs guarantee. You ready for this?
Well, if there's just an infinite need for labor or something
You
like that.
redefine labor as any way anyone could possibly spend their time.
And then you just give them a basic income.
And then you just give them a basic income. Yeah.
That's actually what happened in Australia for an Aboriginal grant in the 70s. They phrased it so loosely that they were able to do pretty much nothing and they still received the grant.
Nice.
But then they canceled it after that because it was benefiting them too much or something.
Nick, I didn't mean to squash what you were saying. That's my feeling about it, but maybe.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I guess maybe let's imagine a version, like a very optimistic version of the jobs guarantee, where you have, you use like massive AI, and you get Facebook's profile of every person, and you match them up with a really good job for them, and we have a really good mix of objectives that is well matched to the skills of the people in the population.
The dating site.
And then maybe the big difference between that world and the world where we give people basic income is that we're like doing more stuff in the first version. And the trade-off is between freedom and like faster or like more product, more
Right.
infrastructure
I think I
gets
understand
built,
what
or
you're saying,
more
So-
windmills.
I would disagree that we're doing more stuff in the jobs guarantee version. I think if we have stuff that we want done,
All right,
Yeah.
let's
But I think
use a concrete
he's
example.
assuming.
What if it's like a space elevator
yeah,
to the moon so that we can colonize Mars?
sure.
So I
Right?
think
So
we
like
think-
we could give people basic income.
Yeah.
People would have lots of freedom,
Yeah.
and we'd have no space elevator and no colony on
We
Mars.
could print
or-
the place at 3D space
Yeah.
elevator.
Well, let's assume something labor intensive. Bethany, did you
Well, I
want
was
to
just
say
going to
something?
say that I think I follow what Nick is saying, which is that he's arguing there's like an infinite number of somewhat useful things that we could have people
Yes.
do, and maybe even if we had people do things really efficiently, we would still have more things for them to do.
So
that would be what was happening. Is that a good summary
Right.
of the jobs guarantee? Like we'd be efficiently doing like useful
Yeah.
things, but the
Yeah, let's
question
say we
is,
could
are
get a
we-
really long list of things that we all agree would be good to
Right.
have done, and they're labor intensive. And we could do them faster or slower. And if we give everyone a basic income, we might not do any of them.
So
They might have more slowly.
So yes, this is exactly what I understood Nick's point to be, and this is what I was responding to.
Okay.
So you don't need a jobs if you have a list of stuff you want to get done and you want to pay for, you can do that. You don't need a jobs guarantee for that. You can just keep adding stuff to your list and paying for stuff and building space elevators and building all kinds of stuff. You don't need a jobs guarantee. If you are paying for more stuff, that might reduce the level of basic income you can afford because you need to activate more resources going towards those specific things. But it's always going to be a trade-off. You always want to be thinking about is it worth it to get people to spend their time this way instead of the way they would normally be spending their time, and then that'll determine kind of the level of basic income you have.
Right.
But as soon as it's a jobs guarantee, then you're no longer making the decisions based on that anymore. You're making the decisions based on we want to give everyone a job. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
If someone has
It
a
does
basic
to me.
income, they might accidentally create the next super fiber that makes the space elevator even cheaper or better or whatever.
Yeah, and I think this is related to my point from before, which is a lot of the most important work that humans have done have come from effort that no one ever would have thought to pay for.
Right.
So you have to balance, if you're paying for something specific, you have to balance against, the fact that you're reducing those possibilities on the other side.
let me
It's
just-
not an easy calculation.
Let me just summarize how I take a few things. So one thing we would say is that it's not just people's freedom, it's also opportunity cost. Maybe they would spend their time in a better way. It's also like natural resources are being used to build the space elevator too. And then the second point I also think is good, which is like the best case for a jobs guarantee just looks like not having a jobs guarantee and deciding you want to pay for all that stuff that naturally creates a job for everybody, even though it's not guaranteed.
Doesn't have to be
So the
jobs
minute you
guaranteed.
guarantee it, you're likely to have inefficiency. I mean, it would just be very hard
Right.
not to have that.
Yeah.
And I think another problem with the jobs guarantee is that it provides a kind of minimum income for everyone. The job guaranteed jobs aren't gonna pay below a certain amount. So that takes away a lot of possibilities where maybe you would have paid someone a tiny amount to do something slightly different from what they would ordinarily do, but it's worth it, and like that. So that removes a lot of potential market efficiency that you could have there.
That's the guarantee part, that's the problem.
Well, it's not just a guarantee. If you guaranteed a job and didn't guarantee that they get paid anything, then that
that's the
might
problem.
not be as much of a problem, right?
Oh,
What?
What? If you guaranteed everyone a job,
But you had no
but
minimum
maybe it's
wage or-
volunteer work or
Oh, I
something
see.
like that,
Right, yeah.
then you can still have people pay very small amounts of money to incentivize
Right.
people to spend their time other than how they normally spend it,
Yeah.
and then that would be more efficient. Right.
Actually,
Yeah.
Scott Sands talks about Saudi Arabia's job guarantee, about how 70% of the population is employed by the government and no one really cares about their work or anything like that because they're just going to get paid for doing nothing.
Yeah. You can always come up with examples of things, but I like to think about like the hypothetical, like Nick pointed out, the hypothetical best case scenario for something like this, and what it would look like, and how even that is maybe not a good idea for the reasons we're talking
Although
about.
we probably wouldn't have had the pyramids if we didn't have,
The pyramids,
forced labor.
No,
that
it
was
wasn't forced labor. People wanted to do it before their pharaoh god.
Oh, even better.
And so they
Even better.
And they actually got like health care and they had this bubblegum tasting beer, and so they wanted to do it.
So yeah, I mean, but forced labor also isn't I guess it is kind of a job guarantee in some way.
It is.
Yeah.
In a way it is.
The difference, I would say, is that with the forced labor and with slavery and even with the pyramids and stuff like that, You're doing it because you want the output of the labor. You want the thing that's being produced by the
Right.
work.
They weren't doing it for the slaves.
It's not like, slaves need jobs.
Yeah.
We don't care about these cotton plants, but we're gonna give
They
these.
hate living
We're
in
gonna
their own homes in
and-
Africa. They really
yeah.
need us to take them
Right,
away.
right. Yeah.
Pyramids were not built by slaves, they were built by people, by farmers and things in the off season. So they,
I'm glad that this last bit helped me kind of see the difference. I
Yeah.
think, and I would say
Yeah, Sultan's here.
I think it is helpful to think about a kind of a continuum. Like
Yeah.
you would have a knob that you could turn between maximizing basic income and people's freedom and with the work that you want to get done.
Yep.
And that turning the knob all the way toward, you can afford zero basic income because you're working so hard to build a space elevator.
Right.
That isn't necessarily the same as the jobs guarantee.
Right.
That's
Right.
one thing.
Yeah.
It might look pretty close. Like if you did that really well, if you did a great job at that, it might come super close to the jobs guarantee. But I think, I agree that the fact that the other changes that the universal basic income would allow, like what you're saying, like paying someone a little to do something a little different than they would.
Yeah.
Like
Right.
that does seem like a really rich possibility for allowing new kinds of really good things. And I was trying to think like, okay, if we were on the debate stage
Yeah.
being asked this question, like what would be a way to communicate that? And I think like when he talks about his wife, like that is what he's trying to get at.
Yeah.
And I think it's like a pretty good way
Yeah.
of pointing to it. Actually, for like
Yeah.
like in a little soundbite for
Right.
a kind of naive audience, at least related to these issues.
Right.
It's a way of holding up an example of a kind of activity.
Right.
But it might be interesting to think about like what would alternatives be? Like how could he have said it
Right.
that would point more pointedly to the
Yeah.
kind of
More
freedom
people. And don't
and
forget, he's
the,
capturing a lot
I
of
mean-
interest from women with that example too.
I think-
Housewives.
I think I have a few sound bites on this. One of them is that if we need work done, if we need to build infrastructure, et cetera, we should absolutely do that. And we should use the minimum amount of labor possible. Otherwise, we're just wasting people's time. To the extent that we're creating jobs to push money to workers, we're not doing it because there's work that needs doing. So as a consequence of doing the things we need to do, some jobs might be created, but that shouldn't be the reason why we do it. That's a side effect.
I think that's a good one. What about the other side though? The changes that might happen in what people's lifestyles and activity patterns look like because new kinds of jobs that maybe don't even pay anything
Right.
are
I think you could pick your example of like nobility from history that we heard at the beginning of science. So I think pretty much all of science, if I understand correctly, was by independently wealthy people in the beginning
Patrons
who
too.
were writing to each other or who had patrons.
Artists had that.
Darwin was independently wealthy.
Yeah.
Darwin's controversial politically sometimes, but like he had all this ability to just like work on his
Yeah.
idea for a really long
he was a
time.
Wedgwood.
Because he had the funds
He was
to
a
travel and the funds to
Wedgwood.
do
the
it.
narrative Wedgwood, right?
They made the pottery in Wedgwood.
Yeah. Oh, he was?
I think his wife was.
Oh, wow.
No, his wife was actually his cousin.
Cousin, that's right. Yeah, I talked about that. I don't know if that would connect with people or not, but if you had like a concrete example of how like a lot of innovation can come out of people's time. I mean, I also think his example of his wife is good too for the fact that people use their time well.
I think it's a good example.
Yeah.
I just I wish you would kind of frame it a little bit differently, but I do think that's a good example of the kind of valuable work.
But I'm not sure
Yeah.
it hits on your
You
point.
don't think it is?
I do,
Oh.
and I think that trying to win people over with the idea of being more innovative or having time to pursue it, I don't think that reaches as many people as the whole idea of a mother and raising children.
Right.
That's just bottom line.
Because a lot of people maybe don't feel that innovative.
Exactly.
Or they don't
A
realize
lot
that
of
they
people
could be.
don't realize it, don't feel it, and are suspicious of it in
And
some way.
and they don't realize that you can have 10,000 lazy people sitting around, and then one person innovates,
right.
and then that makes it worth
That
it.
makes it worth
Yeah.
it. Yeah, they don't.
Yeah.
They just think of the average person.
That's like not
Yeah.
a politically good message because people
Right.
are all supposed to be on the same level.
Right.
So when you
Right.
talk about that, it kind of makes it seem like some people are more important than other people.
Yeah. So we got some
Yeah, I don't know,
comments.
Nick, it's a good
Oh,
question.
yeah.
So Tommy said a little while back when we were talking about efficiency, Brett Weinstein often says we've defined efficiency as the rate at which we convert useful resources and energy into useless trash and heat. So I think
It's useless what?
trash and heat.
Oh,
Yeah, so he's saying like efficiency is like how quickly can we waste stuff.
right.
I think some people do, when they're thinking about efficiency narrowly, it kind of it kind of ends up in that result. But I think that's obviously not the definition of efficiency, and we need to think about efficient with respect to what.
Right. Like if people are commuting more to do the same job, that's wasting more resources. That's what I mean by inefficiency
Yeah.
too, right? Like that's worse for the environment.
Yeah, for
'Cause
sure.
If you have 10 workers instead of 2, those people are all commuting in a car, and that's inefficiency. You're wasting more, not less.
Yeah.
I mean, you're wasting more with inefficiency. Yeah.
Yeah, and he says when he's talking about inefficient government jobs, he says, I bet those people would be rational to resist you when you try to bring them a reality check by passing UBI. So yeah, I mean, I think people who know their jobs are going to go away once we stop creating jobs for people, some of them might be resistant to it.
Yeah.
But if the UBI is high enough, maybe higher than $1,000 per month, I don't know, maybe the degree of resistance isn't going to be that high because, now they'll still get paid, but they don't have to work this government job anymore, that kind of thing. Tommy was saying I argued a point in favor of slavery. I'm definitely not in favor of slavery, but it is true that slavery is better than a jobs guarantee because the product of the labor is actually useful.
Oh man, there's some other drawbacks. Let's go on the record with
That's
some
a
additional
soundbite. You don't
drawbacks.
want that.
Yeah, you don't
Yeah.
want that.
I don't mind sound bites. I like sound bites. I like controversial sound bites. Yeah. And he's bringing up new kinds of jobs that don't pay anything, open source coding for him. Yeah, that's an example. There's a lot of people who are doing stuff for free. When we were talking about the free rider problem, we were talking about Wikipedia and how that manages to exist and people have an incentive to contribute and nobody's being paid.
Right.
Here's another example of a new kind of job. My full-time job could be learning how to attract women. That would be a really efficient use of my time, and people don't normally approve of that, I think. Yeah, you could work on that. The only problem is that if there's a basic income, then a lot of other men are going to be working on
Oh
that.
yeah, it's gonna raise
Yeah.
the bar.
It's just gonna-
One of those things where exactly.
Yeah. Anyone have any more comments before we get to another
I
clip?
want another
Let's
clip.
go.
Yeah,
All right,
I'm excited for some more clips.
Yeah.
Senator Booker, a federal jobs guarantee or $1,000 a month. Are those the best solutions there? Please respond.
Well, first of all, I'm happy to get in finally, and I just want to say, as a great New Jerseyan, Yogi Berra said, I am having deja vu.
Oh, actually, I want to skip this.
I'm having deja
We
vu.
talked about it a lot.
He doesn't answer the question.
Oh, he doesn't.
Yeah, no. We're going to go here.
Senator Warren, you wrote that blaming job loss on automation is, quote, a good story, except it's not really true. So should workers here in Ohio not be worried about losing their jobs to automation?
So the data show that we've had a lot of problems with losing jobs, but the principal reason has been bad trade policy. The principal reason has been a bunch of corporations, giant multinational corporations, who've been calling the shots on trade, giant multinational corporations that have no loyalty to America. They have no loyalty to American workers. They have no loyalty to American consumers. They have no
This is why
loyalty
she
to
seems
American
punitive.
communities.
Talking
They are
about.
loyal only to their own.
We were talking about how somebody
bottom
called her
line.
punitive in the debate.
I have a
and
plan
I
to
was saying
fix
this
that.
might have been part
And
of
it's
it.
accountable capitalism. It says you want to have one of the giant corporations in America, then by golly, 40% of your board of directors should be elected by your employees. That'll make a difference when a corporation decides, gee, we could save a nickel by moving a job to Mexico, when there are people on the board in the boardroom saying, no, do you know what that does to our company? Do you know what that does to our community, to what it does to our workers? We also need to make it easier to join a union and give unions more power when they negotiate. We need to restructure strength in this economy, and that's where it starts.
So here's an example.
Okay.
Here's an example where, unlike the jobs guarantee, you're like, no, we actually want inefficiency actively.
Right.
In the sense that what people don't really think about when you're talking about moving jobs overseas is like, now we get the output and we don't have to do the work ourselves. Right? And she's saying like that's a huge problem, which is interesting because of course right now it is a huge problem because people need their jobs for their income. So it's not that she's not like picking up on something,
And
but
also the externalities are moved overseas and we don't get all the coal dust.
right, we don't have the pollution. I mean, it could be bad for the people overseas, but that's not what she's arguing.
Yeah, and it also kind of to push back on that too, if we have better environmental regulation and we
True.
do this
It could
stuff
be worse for the
here,
environment.
then
Yeah.
for the overall global
Some
environment,
people
it could
make
be better
arguments
for us
like
to
that,
do
and
stuff
that's
here.
reasonable
Yeah.
enough. And they make human rights arguments similarly, like it gets pushed to like places where the workers are more abused or something like
And
that.
I don't buy those arguments.
I wish
Be-
she wouldn't be so focused on the enemy, the corporations, the big, she said that like 3 times, the big
Yeah.
multinational or whatever corporations, and what they're doing, and they're sort of sitting in what's like Succession, you know, they're
Yeah.
sitting around in boardrooms thinking about ways to make money at the expense of the worker. And
They're not thinking about ways to make money at the expense of the worker. They're
Just
thinking about ways to make money.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly, right. It's
That's
not,
kind of like what corporations are supposed to do.
It's what they're
Right.
supposed to do. Yeah. And I think, you know, I've said this before, that I think by expecting employers to take care of the people in their capacity as workers, the government is foisting their own responsibility onto the private sector. This is the government's job. It's not the job of private employers to take care of people.
This
and-
is go ahead. This is a more common point, but of course she's also not thinking about the American consumer at all. Like it just that this is not as big a deal, but
I think she said consumer in there. She said the word consumer.
But I mean, in the sense that if they move the things overseas, then the products get cheaper for
Yes.
everybody. And so unions are, like we've talked about, a special interest group at the expense often of everybody else.
Yes.
And so it's interesting that she doesn't ever bring that up. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think she's very much aligned with the unions to the point where she doesn't feel.
Or maybe let me rephrase.
Yeah.
It's disappointing for me because I think she means well and like is principled, but in this respect, she's kind of really biased in a way that I can imagine a Republican would have some very legitimate like ways to attack.
Yeah.
Because she just doesn't even mention the trade-offs, right? It's one thing to mention the trade-offs and say like, I still think it's worth it. But it bothers me more when people don't mention the trade-offs at all.
another
Yeah.
sidelight of that is the unions historically have limited what people can do on the job. When I was working in a company, you know, they'd have to call somebody. They couldn't, for example, turn a screw to tighten something. Somebody would have to be called because it was a union mandate that only certain jobs could be done by certain people. So there was a lot of time wasted. Talk about wasted efficiency, and you know that part too. For the most part, managers hated unions coming in, and that's why. I mean, that's one of the reasons why.
There's a lot of inefficiencies. There's also like talent selection inefficiencies. Like there's often rules that you have to be promoted by seniority as opposed to by talent, so that's not as good for efficiency. There's a lot of different issues that wouldn't have to come along with unions, but I guess they sometimes do.
Not the Peter principle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everyone gets promoted to their level of incompetence.
So
I think that's true. I think that's true even if you don't have unions.
Yeah, I don't know if that's
Yeah.
a union thing, but
It might be more true if you don't have unions, because you're promoting all the people who are really good at their jobs until they're not good at their jobs
But what
anymore.
happens is like you
Yeah.
kind of smooth over the union population. So you do something that kind of feels fair for everybody, like seniority, as opposed to something that. So some workers are at a disadvantage being unionized too, like the ones who would have otherwise gotten promoted more quickly, or been more talented or whatever. So again, she doesn't mention any of that stuff. Yeah.
And then there's the issue of those, you're electing 40% of the people. What's stopping them from being corrupted like they are in the U.S. Congress and whatever?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It's huge.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes down to what do we want out of corporations.
Right.
And if you think of corporations as these greedy entities that are really supposed to be providing for workers but aren't, then Elizabeth Warren's plan kind of makes sense,
Yeah, that's-
right?
Right.
Or you'd be
But
trying
that's
those kinds
a
of
totally
things.
bizarre way to think about corporations.
Yeah,
It just seems like she's never taken an economics class if she thinks about corporations like
she's
that.
taken some economics
I know
classes.
she has, but I mean,
Yeah.
I think it's frustrating
Harvard,
because I know
too.
she's really smart.
I think
Yeah.
it is.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of economists who, I mean, most economists are trying to figure out labor problems, right?
Right.
Or a lot of them are. Or most of them assume, even if they're not working on labor, they assume that, like, it's optimal for everyone to have a job or to keep people employed, make sure wages are high enough, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
This is like ingrained. It's
I'm
not
not-
like Elizabeth
yeah.
Warren is out there or
I
something,
know,
right?
I know she's not. It's
Yeah.
not really her specific. Like, I feel like she
Yeah.
should just be picking on her, but she's just the one who's kind of like driving these things in.
Yeah, I mean, that's fine to pick on her. I'm picking on her too for stuff
Yeah.
that other
It's
people
also
say.
her roots, and she talks about that. Her,
Yeah.
Working class roots, how she had to, claw her way. up
Claw her
and
way.
all that. And so she values work.
Right.
She
Yeah.
values it.
But she was also able to rise in a profession where you don't have
Yeah.
unions like law, right? Like
Yeah.
she was able
Yeah.
to be a talented person that got ahead.
And she also received a lot of awards and things for claiming Native American heritage. And she
Oh,
did not.
Oh, well, that.
I mean,
I don't think
that she's
that's a-
I
talented.
don't think
Yeah.
that's relevant.
No, not really.
Um,
But
Yeah.
that's how she climbed up through the ranks much faster because she was able to claim these
That's
things.
I mean,
disputable.
so that's certainly possible, but it's not really to the point that we were getting at here, which is kind of her perspective and why she has that perspective and that kind of thing.
And a lot of them do. A lot of
yeah.
Democrats do come from working class families and tell that story.
Sure.
And have that close to their hearts, that you have to work hard. And I worked hard with my parents, and I'm a first generation immigrant, and this is how it goes. This is how it goes. You don't.
Or not only this is how it goes, but they're nostalgic for a time when it went that way
Yeah.
more than it does today,
Yeah.
and they want to
Yeah.
bring it back.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
agree.
Like with was it 1940s, 90% of people were able to be better off than their parents, and then in
Yeah.
1995, it was 50-50 or something like that. So
Right. Yeah.
But I think the main point is sort of right, that the job losses, the loss of manufacturing jobs is not so much due to robots and more due to manufacturing happening
Well,
overseas more.
I think it depends on how you frame it. I do know that I think it was PolitiFact did a fact check on that statement, and they were like false. That people agree that it's automation, it's not trade. That's causing
really?
it. Yeah,
Oh.
yeah. But it's also true that it's not. So it's happening in places like obviously Andrew Yang goes around and says like, oh, in Ohio they lost so many jobs, et cetera, et cetera.
Raise your hand if you stand.
Right. Well, yeah, but he talks about like the number of jobs that were eliminated in places that
Yeah.
elected Donald Trump. All that stuff is happening. Of course, that's true. But then in aggregate, we're actually not seeing job losses because even though certain places are losing jobs, other places are gaining jobs, and the level of employment is actually not
Right.
being impacted by technology. And it's not because we have a federal job guarantee, which would obviously cause this effect. It's because we have similar policies that do the same kind of thing that just aren't as specific and blatant. Yeah.
Let's talk about specific states too.
Right.
That have lost jobs to automation, and those are states that voted for Trump. I mean,
Yeah.
just being smart that way.
And I think that's true. I also think this is not an inevitable effect of automation. Like the fact that that happened is a combination of automation and how our policy responded. And we do labor policy and employment policy, labor market policy, usually at the level of the whole country, not at the level of individual
Yeah.
states. So now you see some states fall behind.
Isn't
Some
it
cities are
also-
really prosperous, that kind of
Isn't
stuff.
it also
Yeah.
related to the fact that some of the jobs that have been lost did have these like unions, and so they were kind of like particularly high paying or whatever for what they were,
Yeah.
and then they're not being replaced by similar types.
I think that's another huge factor. If you're trying to pay people a certain minimum amount, then it goes away.
Yeah.
And this could affect the trade thing too, right? Like if we could pay our workers the same that China pays their workers, then maybe we wouldn't lose those jobs, that kind of thing. I mean, like it's all. I mean, it's a hard thing to kind of like dissect too much because in here we know that eliminating jobs is a good thing, that this is what we want, so we're not like
Right.
maybe it's like, well, how do we get more of that, right? And it's like, well, maybe more trade, more automation, you know, like that kind of stuff. Maybe a basic income, so we don't have to like, you know, maybe no more minimum wage, you know, like all that kind of stuff. Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
The World Economic Forum posted an article that for every one robot for 1,000 workers, wages are decreased by 5%.
Oh.
So the U.S. has, what was it? Is like the 7th most automated country. I mean, they have like what is it? What was it? 35 or something per 100,000, and so the
Right.
or decreased significantly.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So Tommy says, remind me, what are the similar policies that result in a jobs guarantee-like effect? Minimum wage, other policies? So yeah, I think minimum wage is one of them.
Tariffs for that cause $80,000 for a $50,000 steel job or whatever.
Right. So tariffs are a big one. We don't want China to sell us really cheap steel because we want to force American workers to do it. So that kind of stuff. You know, backing out of trade agreements like NAFTA. Like NAFTA was probably good for you know, saving labor. The TPP probably would have been good for saving labor too. We back out of these trade agreements or never agree to them. That kind of thing. And I think a big one is monetary policy. So we're using the labor market as a tool for funneling money to consumers, when really it's supposed to just be a market for getting people to do things. And the way monetary policy works is that they lower interest rates. The central bank lowers interest rates as a way to incentivize more borrowing in the private financial sector. So businesses are able to borrow more, they're able to hire more workers. Businesses that maybe shouldn't even be in business are able to stay in business because they can keep rolling over their debt and borrowing more. So there's a lot of employment out there that's being funded by debt, because unlike with something like a basic income where we're directly adding new money to the economy and handing it to consumers, what we're doing is we're indirectly creating new money in the private financial sector through all the lending, and then that money kind of trickles to consumers through the labor market. So we're really using the labor market as a way to get people money. So it's not quite a jobs guarantee, but I would say that historically what we've done in response to technological advancement is we've had labor movements. Unions are another great example. So the fact that unions are even legal, you know, is an example of kind of creating and protecting jobs for people. So it's really everywhere. Like you can kind of look all around and see this kind of stuff. So I would say that the federal jobs guarantee is a more explicit perpetuation of this status quo that we've kind of been in for a long time, for centuries, perhaps.
Is that mechanism of creating jobs through monetary policy, does that affect, like, does that tend to create jobs in certain industries or certain kinds of jobs? Like what kinds of companies are these that sort of shouldn't be in business but can stay in business by borrowing?
I think it's all across the board. Yeah. I know that. So on the one hand, it's all across the board. On the other hand, you see the side effect of a ballooning of the private financial sector. So Wall Street gets really huge. You see asset bubbles, that kind of stuff. I would think of that as more of a side effect than what they're directly trying to target. But it is something that you get as a result of this way of doing things, of using the financial sector to push money to people. So I like to say that if you have a basic income that's high enough, that's calibrated to the full amount the economy can sustain, then you're not going to have interest rates that are too low. You're not going to have Wall Street asset bubbles and crashes like 2008 anymore. All that stuff just goes away. You won't have recessions anymore that are just a result of problems in financial markets. If you have a recession and you have an optimal level of basic income, then the only way you can get that recession is if there's an actual hit to your real productive capacity. You get hit by an asteroid, there's a war, something happens, right? So
it's so funny that we have these recessions based on financial things.
Yeah.
Or that the economy often gets better during a war.
Yeah.
It really should show you that something is wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so Tommy says, you think unions are inappropriate in general? I mean, yes, I do, with some caveats. Like I would also say that I think minimum wage is inappropriate in general. But if you were to ask me if I could press a red button and make minimum wage go away, would I do it? The answer is no. Because it's kind of like these things, I would say minimum wage, unions, tariffs, all of these things are Band-Aids that we're using to kind of compensate for the fact that we don't have a proper mechanism to get spending money into the hands of consumers. We don't have a basic income, so we compensate for it in all of these different ways. And that includes, like our various, food stamps and social programs and stuff like that. Yeah, we couldn't get people their money, or we could have, but we aren't getting people their money, so we come up with all these workarounds. But it's all kind of like this hodgepodge of things. And then another side effect is the expansion of the private financial sector. The 2008 collapse is a side effect of this as well. So I wouldn't press a button to kind of remove all these inefficiencies because they're kind of there. They're like duct tape that are holding the system together. But I would want to fix the underlying problems. And then as we gradually increase the basic income, we might start to realize that there are certain other things we don't need anymore because those things were only in place because they were compensating for this problem. Yeah. If we had a UBI, then I think a lot of things get a lot simpler. And I don't think people realize how many of the problems that we face are the result of us not having a UBI. Someone said to me once, Alex, basic income is not a magic wand that solves all the world's problems. And I said, yeah, I know it's not a magic wand that solves all the world's problems. It's a magic wand that solves all the problems that are caused by a lack of UBI. And I think that's more than what people expect. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good.
And there's still going to be problems once we have a basic income. But there's not going to be this problem of how do we get spending money to consumers. And this is a big problem. And once we've solved it, we can look around and it's going to be a lot easier to think about how to address some of the other problems that are still remaining.
Yeah. And I know I was talking about unions too.
Yeah.
So I guess I'll just second that. Then you don't have to have such a tension between what's good for an efficient economy that produces good things for the people versus what gets people money. Right now we kind of have a tension between those two things, and if you had a basic income, you wouldn't have as much tension. And
Yes.
that includes the tension created by unions in that direction.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And good treatment too. So we didn't talk about this explicitly yet, but
Yeah.
unions also negotiate for treatment, but if people have enough of a UBI, they have more bargaining power.
Yeah, they just don't have to
They
work a
naturally
job
don't
that
have to
doesn't
take
treat them
certain
well.
jobs and things
Yeah.
like that too, so.
Yeah. So Sultan says, I think there will always be new jobs that we cannot imagine right now. For example, bike renting businesses created a lot of jobs like bike pickers in China. And yeah, I think that's right. There's always going to be jobs. There's always going to be new kinds of jobs, beyond anything we could think of. But what's also true is that there's no law of economics that says an efficient labor market will somehow provide consumers with the optimal level of incomes such that they can activate the economy's full productive capacity, receive the full benefit from the economy. And that's never going to be the case. It never has been the case, and it never will be the case. So, even if you have new jobs, which you will, it doesn't change the fact that you need a basic income. Tommy says, I'm also curious to hear more about how does UBI help prevent the economic bubbles? People already have enough money to spend, so we don't need to use way too many loans for that purpose. Yeah, I think that intuition is right. And the idea is that we use monetary policy to create an incentive for businesses to take out more loans, for actually anyone to take out more loans. They want the businesses to take out more loans because they want to create jobs and they want to boost consumer spending. But as a side effect of that, you get all the speculation and asset bubbles and stuff like that. If you set the UBI high enough, then that allows us to rein in the private financial sector. You no longer have to incentivize all this lending. So then you can keep the financial sector at a stable, manageable level. So that's how it does this. I would say, the Great Depression happened as a result of us not having a basic income, and the 2008 crash as well. I think, back in the Great Depression, we were on the gold standard, and it was there were more barriers to kind of like in our thinking to be able to get to something like a basic income. But if we had been able to do that, it would have been great. Yeah. Anyone have any more thoughts before the next clip?
Another
Let's see a clip.
Let's see a clip. Ooh, Elizabeth Warren. Okay.
Thank you, Senator. Secretary Castro, what's your response to Senator Warren's claim that automation is a good story, except it's not really true?
Well, I think what folks have said is that is only part of the.
I'm allowed to pause it because I'm me. I just want to say that part that Elizabeth Warren said is actually correct. Automation is a good story, but it's not actually true. I think that part is right. But then when she goes on to it's not automation, it's trade, then it's like, okay, all right, never mind. Yeah. Okay, let's continue.
The issue, right? I believe that we need to address communities that are being impacted by automation. I'm even willing to pilot something like UBI and to see how that would work. But I think we need to focus on making sure that we spark job opportunity for people across this country. As I mentioned earlier, here in Ohio, in the latest job data, Ohio is losing jobs under Donald Trump. He has broken his promises to Ohio and the industrial Midwest. I would invest in infrastructure to put people back to work. I would invest in a Green New Deal to unleash millions of new jobs in a clean energy economy. I was in Newton, Iowa a few weeks ago, and I visited a place called TPI. Newton, Iowa had a Maytag washing machine manufacturing facility, and then it closed down. TPI manufactures wind turbines. They're putting hundreds of people to work in decent paying jobs and creating a better future for those families. On top of that, let me just say this, we need to support working families. We need to invest in things like universal child care so that people can afford child care instead of having to pay 20% of their income for it.
Yeah, Bethany.
Well, my classic beef with the childcare jobs thing is it's like we need to force people to work and then we need to have somebody take care of their kids because they can't be home with them. Not that working is bad. Some people really want to work and that's good, but some people really want to be home with their own kids.
Some people want to do both.
And some people want to do both, right?
Yeah,
And you can't choose.
Yeah.
You can't choose if you have to have a job.
Right.
It's like we talked about before, and then people's jobs are like watching each other's kids and they can't watch their own kids, and it's like funny that way.
And if you have a basic income, you can use that money to pay for childcare, or you can take care of the child yourself and have the money.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's always something that stands out to me.
Yeah. It's interesting how he talks about piloting UBI, being open to that, but he's still
swerved right away.
Well, everything for him is still in terms of how do we help workers, how do we help people have jobs,
Right.
you know, like, and my intuition is that if he piloted the UBI, it would be like he would do it to see if it helped people in their capacity as workers, right?
Yeah.
Does it help them get jobs, or does it help them,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. So he's very much not, even though he's kind of like open to it on some level,
Right.
he's still thinking of everything in terms of
And I
jobs.
think part of the problem with this, to be fair, is that the UBI amount that Andrew Yang is putting out there doesn't really seem like a very good income for people.
Right.
So it's not like you can imagine yourself just living off of that.
Right.
You still need to have, I mean, it
Right.
would solve poverty for homeless people and stuff, so I'm not saying you couldn't live off of it, but for most people watching, they don't want to replace their, $50,000 a year job with $12,000, and they don't
Right.
feel like they can survive on that. And so, so I think that forces the conversation, even for him, into this idea of it being a stimulus for more jobs and economic growth, because it's just not enough.
It would be nice if Julian Castro said, $1,000 is not enough. We should have a higher basic income. That's kind of like, maybe $1,000 isn't enough. That's an argument for a higher basic income.
Yeah,
Right?
but that's hard because outside of, say, your very unusual view of economics, it's going to just seem way too expensive.
Right.
Especially when it also needs to be paired with healthcare that isn't tied to a job, which they're also talking about as being very expensive.
Right.
So it's a really difficult position to take up there, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah.
It's honestly interesting that Andrew Yang is able to defend his position as well as he is, considering the constraints that I just laid out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's got responses to kind of whatever they come at him with. I'd be interested, if Andrew Yang ever becomes the front runner, to see like what everyone attacks him with. Right?
Yeah, that would be really interesting.
Yeah.
I agree. They're not taking him seriously enough yet.
I think
May not.
I think there might be a limit, like a ceiling on his potential,
Yeah.
if he sticks with the automation story.
Oh, I don't think that's why.
Well, there might be other reasons too, but yeah, what was yours?
Well, just the UBI at all. I think that's placing a kind of a sense that people have that that's all he's talking about.
Yeah.
Because unlike you and everybody who comes here, don't see how it touches everything. I mean, they don't see the complexity of the problems that it might solve. They're just thinking about it in a very narrow way, and that's his only issue. And then so they're not giving him any props for any kind of, foreign policies. How is he gonna be with foreign leaders? How is he gonna be on the world stage? How is he gonna be on these other things? How is he gonna be with, he didn't even talk about impeachment really. He didn't talk about moral outrage. He didn't deliver the sense of value that Democrats are used to, really.
Well, I don't think he has moral outrage.
You're right.
And I actually like that. I love that.
I think that's a problem though for this go round. People are so outraged. I mean, Democrats want that outrage to be.
They think he has one policy, but he has over 150. So.
I know, but he really is only known, and people don't explore it unless, there's a reason to.
It'll be interesting to see after Friday. So on Friday, he's going to spend 10 hours straight answering questions online on video.
Right.
What?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so.
Coming to Northeastern, I wondered if he was going to be doing it in Austin.
Oh, maybe, I don't know.
Maybe he'll be at home with his children or something like that.
Yeah.
And they might show up, like in
those ads where the
those ads had it in what was it? That show on Netflix that they canceled. I forget. Well, they had the opponent had spent like 24 hours answering questions. And he shows of his children and things, and his wife and whatever.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Okay. I think 10 hours is more reasonable. Yeah. So Tommy has a question. He says, speaking of the gold standard, I was thinking about how might a non-monetarily sovereign government enact UBI? For instance, could California start UBI before the federal government does it?
Interesting. We talked about this recently, right? What was
Yeah. So last week, if you haven't seen it, last week we talked about Puerto Rico.
Right.
And we were basically asking this exact question.
Yeah.
It's not an easy thing to do. You have to be able to spend money into the economy somehow. If you can find a way to borrow, if you can find a way to kind of, being monetarily sovereign essentially means that you've figured out a way, or people trust you enough to be able to borrow at a level that is only kind of constrained by the productive capacity of the economy or something like that. You're constrained by inflation. People are trusting you to keep prices stable instead of trusting you to, be able to physically pay back your debt, because you can always pay it back by printing money and that kind of thing. So it's kind of this shift in trust, and I don't think there's a clear dividing line between who counts as monetarily sovereign and who doesn't. I think it's a matter of obviously if you have a central bank and you have monetary policy and that kind of thing. Then you're more monetarily sovereign. But there's degrees of central bankishness too. Like smaller countries might have their own currency, but they have something that looks more like a currency board where they're pegging their currency to, it's not as free floating, that kind of thing. I think in order to do this, you have to figure out a way to do the equivalent of printing money or borrowing indefinitely, or justifying, reducing spending in other areas.
Or my idea last week with the Eastern Band of Cherokee having the casinos throughout Puerto Rico, and then putting all the funds together, the revenues together, and funding a basic income that way.
Yeah, so I think that falls under the category of figuring out ways to raise money, to bring money in, that kind of thing. So I think, we were talking about Puerto Rico and how there's, fruit rotting on the vine and stuff like that. And that's resources that are obviously explicitly being wasted. So I think even if you have a small basic income there and it has to take away from other programs or something like that, it might be worth it because now you can buy your neighbor's vegetables and stuff like that. So I think there's always some level of basic income you can do, but it might not be the full amount that you could achieve if you're like the United States government.
Yeah, we also talked about like bootstrapping currencies.
Yes.
On top of like having a little local state currency that maybe nobody trusts outside of the state, but if you're able to somehow get it to be trusted or pass a law that certain people accept it at par or something.
Yeah, I mean, so if you can bootstrap a currency and have your own free-floating currency and be able to maintain its purchasing power, then you kind of become monetarily sovereign.
Right.
And that's kind of that's kind of like the best way to do it, if you can figure out how to
Which
do
is
that.
tricky, obviously.
But even without that, I think it's worth diverting funds from other things for at least a token amount of basic income. So if we're talking about California, maybe they pay $10 a month to their citizens or something like that. And it would have to come out of their budget. They'd have to like figure out how to get the money there, but at least they'd have kind of like the framework for it in place. And then they could look at, well, wait a minute, now everyone's getting $10 independent of the labor market. What kind of difference does that make? Are people able to trade with each other more directly now that they have their own source of money, that kind of thing?
I guess one last thing we talked about is this isn't a basic income, but we talked about the value of sometimes of cash transfers over the way that money already being spent on benefits might be spent. So that's not exactly like a basic income, but you could replace certain kinds of benefits with just cash for people and make them more efficient.
So I think there's some benefits that make sense to be cash. Like food stamps, there's no reason why it should have those restrictions on there. There's some benefits that the government needs to figure out the resources directly, like healthcare and stuff, and infrastructure and stuff like that. But yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity there to just turn in-kind programs into just direct cash programs. Yeah.
Good question. Yeah, you would like the Puerto Rico meetup video.
Yeah, Tommy, I would encourage you to check out the Puerto Rico discussion. I mean, it kind of ended with us saying that it's a really difficult problem and it's hard to solve. Yeah, but there are things you can do. Yeah. And then also, I also want to bring this up, which is that it's possible for a monetarily sovereign country to provide basic income for other countries, right? So the United States, if they wanted to, could provide a basic income for Venezuela. They could provide a basic income for everyone in the world if they wanted to, right? And ultimately, kind of like the end game here is that you kind of want we have a global economy. We should want to have a global currency, and we should want to have a global basic income, right? But that's kind of like a few steps removed from where we are now. Yeah. Any comments before we get to the next clip? Julian Castro was very inspiring of conversation.
Oh, yeah.
Senator Warren, I've been talking to Americans around the country about automation, and they're smart. They see what's happening around them. Their Main Street stores are closing. They see a self-serve kiosk in every McDonald's, every grocery store, every CVS. Driving a truck is the most common job in 29 states, including this one. 3.5 million truck drivers in this country, and my friends in California are piloting self-driving trucks. What is that going to mean for the 3.5 million truckers or the 7 million Americans who work in truck stops, motels, and diners that rely upon the truckers getting out and having a meal? Saying this is a rules problem is ignoring the reality that Americans see around us every single day.
Saying there's a rules problem, do you say?
What is that?
What do you mean by that?
The problem, like if you required 40% of the board seats to be, if you did a rule that 40% of the board seats.
Yeah.
I see. Yeah.
I don't know.
I think that's kind of what he's saying. Yeah.
There must have been something she said before that had something to do with rules. I don't remember what it was.
I mean, he was following up Julian Castro, who had just said.
No, but there was something said before that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what he's saying is it's not just a regulatory problem. It's not just multinational corporations are greedy and we need to put them in line and that kind of thing.
I think it's more fundamental.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah, or how do we support unions and that kind of thing. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a valid way to interpret it.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay. So right.
At one point, Joe Biden was saying something like, he was talking about the assault weapons ban, and he said that gun violence improved exponentially.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, And I looked up that word on Google, and then I was like, oh, it's a real word, and then I realized no. But I was like trying to rationalize. I was trying to rationalize
Yeah.
that.
Well, let's
Yeah.
just mention a record player.
I mean, he's quirky.
He's a little quirky. He had a
so-
stuttering problem as a kid, so I forgive him.
So I think Andrew Yang is talking about the trucker jobs being automated away, that kind of thing. And anytime he says something like that, it makes me think the plural of anecdote is not data, right? So he's got all these stories, and they all do.
12 million jobs by itself would have a big impact.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If they're in the right locations, which is what he talks about for the election too.
Yeah, and I think
Swing states.
I think maybe Andrew Yang assumes that these policies like federal jobs guarantee and maybe some of the policies we have now that kind of create and protect jobs and that those things aren't going to come in and protect the trucker jobs, or that they're not going to
I remember an Alex of a few years ago
yeah.
who used to believe that it was inevitable to have a basic income.
I used to think more like Andrew Yang
Yeah.
back in 2013.
It's so long ago. We were so young and naive back then.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just saying, it seems like a compelling position to,
Yeah.
at least you,
Yeah.
knowing
Yeah.
how software was advancing, you said it was
Yeah.
another level of advance that people hadn't seen in
Yeah.
a long time. It was different from what we'd seen before, and so it's understandable that he wouldn't think that the regulations we have now would do enough.
Right. Yeah, technologists really believe that this is an existential threat.
Right.
What technologists don't understand is that the number of jobs in the economy has nothing to do with how much labor we need, and it has everything to do with how many jobs we want people to have. And that's gonna be true until we have something like a UBI. Yeah.
Shift.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You guys want another one?
Yeah.
Senator Warren, respond, please.
So, I understand that what we're all looking for is how we strengthen America's middle class. And actually, I think the thing closest to the universal basic income is Social Security. It's one of the reasons that I put forward a plan to extend the solvency of Social Security by decades and to add $200 to the payment of every person who receives Social Security right now and every person who receives disability insurance right now. That $200 a month will lift nearly 5 million families out of poverty, and it will sure loosen up the budget for a whole lot more. It also has a provision for your wife, for those who stay home to do caregiving for children or for seniors, and creates an opportunity for them to get credit on their Social Security. So after a lifetime of hard work, people are entitled to retire with dignity.
Thank you, Senator
I
Warren.
see this as an important question about I want to understand the data on this.
Senator,
And
thank you very
I
much.
want to make sure we're responding to make this work.
Yeah, I guess she followed up with him after that. Something I read said that she was interested in talking to him more about it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that they're having a conversation about it now.
That's
Yeah,
great.
It is great.
That was a
Yeah.
pretty respectful answer. Right
It
there,
was,
I thought,
very,
actually.
and I mean, she's right, Social Security, we
Yeah.
talked about that.
Right.
Yeah.
Of course, that's age-based.
Yeah. But she makes an
And
interesting
work-based.
point. Her point there, which was subtle, was actually quite important, which is that his wife is also not earning any Social Security.
That's right.
What if she doesn't have a husband and she's staying home with,
Right,
you
and
know?
that was a big issue way
Right.
back when. I mean,
Yeah.
back in the day, that was the whole thing.
Exactly.
Was
If they're married
feminism.
for
Yeah,
18
absolutely.
years,
Right.
then she could get survivor's benefits.
Right, but I'm
Right.
saying, what if you're a single mom and you can't work very much because
Right.
you have to stay home with your kids? Then you don't get any Social Security for.
Yeah.
It's weird that Social Security is based on your income. In a
It
way,
is.
as we've
It
talked about,
absolutely
because
is,
the more you need it, the less you get
Yeah.
it. It's kind of a funny thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's kind of more like forced saving in a fun
Yeah.
way.
It used to be, the idea was that women should be paid as if they're doing a job for raising children. That was a big thing for a while.
Right.
There were a lot of people who were behind that idea.
Yeah. Interesting.
Anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. That she's being very respectful, and I think they all are treating Andrew Yang with respect in this debate.
Right.
Well, he's been there in other debates, and they've kind of laughed at him.
The
and-
number,
Yeah.
he keeps being there. You
Yeah.
know,
Right.
he's there and then he keeps being there.
Right.
They
Right.
thought, I mean, Amy Klobuchar, I didn't like at first because she laughed at him
Right.
at the
Oh,
first
yeah.
debate. She sort of laughed. that
Yeah.
he wasn't even worth listening to. It's different because he keeps going.
Right.
And
Yeah.
they have to listen because people are behind him.
Yeah,
Yeah.
There are votes
he's
there.
ahead of her in the polls, right?
Who?
Yang's ahead of Klobuchar, I think.
Oh yeah,
Oh, yeah.
he's not ahead of
Yeah,
Warren.
Yeah, right. So who's she to left? I know.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
That's true.
It's interesting, yeah.
He has some staying power. They know he has voters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And he's not like making a mockery of the whole thing the way maybe some politicians have in the past who are unconventional. Like he does silly things once in a while,
Yes,
Yang, but he's
right.
generally being respectful
Right,
back.
he is, yeah.
Right.
So I think it,
Yeah.
it's good that they're returning that and
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's different from it's a big reality show and, all that
Yeah,
kind
right.
of thing too. He's not acting that way anymore.
which I
It's more
also
serious.
appreciate. Yeah.
Yeah. And her point, Elizabeth Warren's point about, people who stay home and do care work will get the $200 a month. It feels like, again, you're getting back to this thing of like paying people to do that specific thing instead
Yeah.
of giving the freedom to do the things that are valuable.
Right.
Right.
So then you have to define, well, what counts as care work? How do you qualify for this benefit? That kind of thing. And, like there's all kinds of ways that people live their lives. And, you wouldn't necessarily be able to identify someone as an unpaid care worker. I think she feels that, it addresses his problem. But I think, like we were saying before, the example of his wife is just one example of the
Right.
kinds of things that people can do. And you can't just enumerate them.
And
Yeah.
her whole thing is about, I have a plan for this, I have a plan for this, I have a plan.
Right.
So she just wants to know what it is, so
Yeah.
she can make a plan for it.
Exactly.
Right.
And develop a policy.
Yeah.
What's the
But if you're coming up with plans for examples of broader things,
Right.
then you're kind of missing
Not
the point.
efficient,
Yeah.
what
Oh.
was her $200 a month thing? I didn't quite follow when I
It
was
is-
watching.
She
it.
That
wants-
was for disability.
And
The caregiver's thing was Social Security.
I see. Okay, that you
No,
pay into.
no.
Well, no. So it was for $200 extra for Social Security,
And disability.
$200 extra for disability, and $200 extra for people who are staying home doing care work.
You just get $200 a
That's
month?
not extra, that's just.
On top of nothing, basically.
I think that's what I heard her say.
Oh, I
Yeah.
thought what Nick said, which is that she was saying that people who stay home get to pay and get some sort of Social Security
Yeah, I
anyway
thought
or
that
something
too.
like that.
And then in addition, everybody gets 200 on top.
Do
of that.
people who stay at home don't get some
No, they
kind of
don't
social?
now,
No,
but
she's
she's
saying
talking
that
about
they should.
extending
Oh, they
it.
would.
She
So
said
that-
something like decades of work. I thought
No. She was talking about extending the solvency of
Oh, okay.
Right.
which is not really that much of an issue.
No,
We can.
I thought what she was saying was that people who stayed home to take care of
Yeah.
dependents
Yeah.
Right.
would be able to retire and get Social Security.
That's what I thought she was saying too. And then
Not that
they
would
had.
pay- not that they would get paid along the way.
Right.
Oh,
I thought like
They
the
would
same
elect
thing.
Social Security.
That's what I thought too. That's how I took it.
maybe. Then that doesn't really.
That makes
Okay.
a big difference, though. I mean,
Oh, it makes a big difference, but it's not paying her, giving her money now. I don't know.
Well, it's still
Well,
based on work.
either way, it's still based on work, and she does emphasize, she really did kind of emphasize after a life of hard work,
yeah, right.
people should be able to retire in
Yes,
dignity.
in dignity.
And I'd love for more people, especially in our politics, to be questioning the idea of needing people to work for work's
I
sake.
know.
That would be fantastic.
Nobody does
I
know-
don't think they will.
Yeah.
Not anytime soon.
I think one of the reasons it's such a big hill to climb.
Yeah.
I think it's we get together and talk, and it lets us maybe forget how big a shift it is in thinking.
Yeah.
Is because it's our ideas about what it looks like to have a good life and success
Right.
is so identified with jobs
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
careers and,
Yeah.
and jobs that are within these
Yeah.
Right.
very institutionalized frameworks.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
Well, my hope is that we're kind of at the beginning of a conversation. That's
Shifting that
Yeah.
perspective.
yeah.
I mean,
Um,
some people have that perspective who are already trying to live outside the law, as it were. I mean, artists and writers have always had that perspective, and they've tried to figure out ways to to live and create without having to work, and having to give up your time,
Yeah.
which
Right.
is the most important thing.
And they are doing work. It's just
Yes,
not labor.
right,
It's not paid
right,
labor.
right.
Yeah.
For somebody else's benefit,
Right.
right,
Well, it might still be for somebody else's benefit. They're-
ultimately, but it's
yeah.
something you wanna do.
Right.
Exactly, yeah.
That's the point.
Yeah.
But most people aren't thinking in that way, I agree. They don't naturally come to that.
Well, I think one way to think about it is in terms of how much of our activity the market dominates.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
It's like right now it's like everything. And that the if we had a universal basic income, then that kind of focus would be open to so many more people. Like working and creating, not to create something that you're going to, that's going to be priced by the market and you're going to exchange at the market rate, but that is more like a gift.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think that would be I think a really
It's a big change.
big,
Really
really
big
fundamental
change.
transformation.
It would be nice if we only used the labor market to get people to do things that we needed them to do that they don't ordinarily do.
Right,
And other than that,
yeah,
they can do what they want, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
that's a great ideal.
Yeah.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. So Tommy has a few comments on here. He says, speaking of local currencies, I was wondering about a random idea. Taxpayers paying income taxes and sales taxes could be reimbursed with California dollars or something, since those taxes aren't Pigovian. So Pigovian tax is just a tax on an activity that you don't want people to do. So like, yeah, it's named after an economist named Pigot, and he kind of described this tax. It's like a soda tax or a cigarette tax, or a tax on pollution. Those kinds of things to change people's incentives. Yeah, so taxpayers paying income taxes and sales taxes could be reimbursed with California dollars. I mean, yeah, that kind of thing. So you're kind of coming up with a way of kind of printing new money within your economy. The question is, like, how do you get merchants to accept the California dollars? How do you ensure that the California dollars are, treated as real money by people? And there are ways of doing this. I don't know if you've looked at my website, gresham.org, where I've kind of developed a complementary currency that's based on the dollar. And I've kind of had some ideas in this vein, and that's kind of one of them. But yeah, I mean, I would say that kind of thing is possible. And California probably could launch a basic income using something like the Gresham system. So yeah, you can look into that if you're interested. His next comment is, the barrier to providing UBI for the whole world is anti-cooperative foreign governments. Yes? I'm going to say no. Not at all. The United States could do this right now. If a foreign government says, you're not allowed to send dollars to our people, then we can say, hey, everyone come to America. We can open up our borders and say, everyone come here, we'll give you the basic income.
I mean,
If
there's
it's harder,
some limitations, like they might not be allowed to leave.
that's what I was about to say. So if there are restrictions on people leaving those countries, then, we can figure out, ways to help them escape, that kind of thing. I would say that anti-cooperative foreign governments, like technically they could, murder all their people and prevent them from getting a basic income or something like that. There are extreme things they can do that are like,
Right.
atrocious.
But I think,
But
I don't
yeah.
know.
Also coming here is a problem, I mean, right now, and certainly probably in the future.
You mean people think of it as a problem?
Yeah, immigration is a problem.
Yeah, people think of immigration as a problem.
People don't want
So-
borders open.
Right, but my point is that it's not anti-cooperative foreign governments. It's our own hang-ups.
Oh, okay.
So that includes immigration. That includes giving people free money, that kind of thing. It's not foreign governments.
And
We
the
could
fact that
absolutely do this.
Each
Yeah.
government is elected by its own citizens that kind of want it to serve their interest, and so that's where some of these issues come into. Right?
Yeah.
Like the amount of the basic income that you could afford for your own citizens might be lower if you're giving it to everyone in the world.
Yeah, so it's I think if you let everyone into your country, or if you give it to everyone in the world, it might change or almost certainly changes the amount you can afford. that amount, it might change it, it might make it lower in the short term because now there's more people competing for the same resources. It might make it higher in the long term because, now you've activated more human potential. So there's kind of, some balancing there, and we wouldn't know exactly exactly what we could achieve. Because we have to keep the dollar stable, right? So we can't give people more money than the global economy can handle, otherwise we'll get inflation or something like that. Yeah. Not that inflation is the end of the world, we just see inflation until the inflation brings the purchasing power of the dollar, or brings the purchasing power of the dollar down far enough that the purchasing power of people's basic income is now commensurate with what the global economy can sustain.
So you can't
Right.
produce something at where it can't be produced.
Right. If we don't have the resources, we can't provide the stuff. The resources are the limiting factor on what money we can give people. So let's see.
One more clip. Or you do more?
Tommy has another
Okay, cool.
point here. Alex, you've mentioned again now that the government shouldn't be deciding what people should be doing, but government budgets are for deciding that. What do you think a good budget would be like? I think we kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. We started to, which is that there's certain resources that are best allocated directly by the government. There's certain things that the government should pay for. There's certain things the government should pay people to do, infrastructure, that kind of stuff. Healthcare is something that's probably not going to be allocated efficiently by the market, at least a lot of aspects of it. So the government should be putting resources should be putting money into deciding how to allocate various resources. One of those resources is labor. They need to be paying people to do things, and that's fine. The basic income is for the resources that are most efficiently allocated by the market. Food, if you have money, you're probably going to buy food. There's, like most consumer goods, like services and all those kinds of things, people will buy the things they want and need. So basic income funds the market. So to the extent that there are still resources available after the government has paid for the things that they need to pay for, then you can have basic income. And to the extent that they haven't needed to tie up people's time and labor, then you can give people more freedom. And the basic income can be at a level that gives them whatever that amount of freedom is. So there's of course the question of which resources are best allocated by the government, which resources are best allocated by the market. We could have a whole debate on that. But no matter where you come down, basic income funds the market. So that's kind of how I would imagine the government budget going. In terms of percentages, like 10% for fire departments or 90% for UBI. I don't know. I'm not going to hazard a guess at what the percentages should be. I mean, I think we kind of figure these things out as we go. Well, at the same time, having this framework of saying, okay, if we're the government and we're using resources directly, that's resources that we're taking away from the other economy. So there's always from the private economy. Right. So there's always a trade-off. What's the opportunity cost for those resources?
Yeah.
Guns and butter.
Yeah, guns and butter.
So this is kind of like what Nick was bringing up before too. Like, do we go to the moon? Like, do we go to Mars with an elevator? As a government project, but that would take a lot of resources away from the UBI and the free market. There's just different trade-offs to make there.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Tommy says, people viscerally admire hard work. Diligence is an important virtue. Mm-hmm. In some situations, it takes a huge cognitive adjustment to notice situations in which diligence isn't really virtuous.
Right, it's a great point.
So I think that's a great point. And I think, giving people money, providing people with enough money to get the most benefit from the economy, that solves that problem. That solves the money problem. It doesn't give people a sense of purpose. So we can ask, what are the best ways to provide meaning and purpose to people? And the answer, is probably not forcing them to do useless work. But we might end up deciding that there are activities we want to create for people that activate, kind of those instincts of wanting to work hard and, and feel good and stuff. But in designing those policies, we would recognize that we're spending resources on providing something for people. Maybe those people feel, like they're playing sports and they're being competitive. They feel like they're working hard or something like that. But it's not the case that we're doing it, or we're not as a society pretending that we're doing it because we value the output of that labor. We're doing it for the people. Right. And that there's an argument to be made for, different levels of that kind of intervention. And we certainly see some of it. Yeah.
presentation on this. I forget when it was.
Oh, yeah.
Purpose.
Yeah, I gave a talk a couple months ago. It's not online, but it's called "People Need Money, Not Jobs." Or
Well,
money.
Oh, no, but we had a meetup on
We had a
purpose.
meetup that.
Oh,
had to do
yeah.
with this.
We had a meetup. We had a
One of the
meetup
first
on.
ones.
We had
Last
a
year?
Boston Basic Income discussion on human purpose, so you can check that out. I also wrote a blog post about it on the Gresham website, which you can check out too.
Cool.
Yeah.
Great. One more? Or
One final clip?
thoughts, or- Yeah,
Let's
one
do a final
final
clip.
clip, and then we can
Yeah.
close our time.
Your time is up. I want to give Congresswoman Gabbard a chance to respond.
Thank you. You know, really what this is about is getting to the heart of the fear that is well-founded. As people look to this automation revolution, they look to uncertainty. They don't know how this is going to affect their jobs and their everyday lives. And I agree with my friend Andrew Yang. I think universal basic income is a good idea to help provide that security so that people can have the freedom to make the kinds of choices that they want to see. This has to do with bad trade deals that we've seen in the past that have also driven fear towards people losing the way that they provide for their families. Really what we need to do is look at how we can best serve the interests of the American people. I do not believe a federal jobs guarantee is the way to do that. The value that someone feels in themselves and their own lives is not defined by the job that they have, but is intrinsic to who we all are as Americans, whatever we choose to do with our lives, and we can't forget that.
Thank you very much.
That was a nice response.
Really nailed it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
she did.
That was really
Unfortunately, all of our other responses.
I know.
yeah. Yeah.
But that was a nice response.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
I wonder, does anyone know anything about the culture in Hawaii and whether like they have a different
One of
relationship
No idea.
than other places?
That's a good question.
Actually, there are a lot of homeless people in Hawaii because the climate's so nice. It's like California.
Right,
that way.
Right.
But I wonder if they have a culture that's more open to like other ways of spending your time,
Yeah.
or not like so focused on your job, or I'm
That's
not
a good
sure.
question.
Yeah.
I know they have some politicians there who are talking about basic income
Right.
and piloting it and that kind of thing. Yeah. So let's actually go around and get people's final thoughts. It can be on that clip or on the debate as a whole or anything we talked about. Bethany.
I mean, I thought it was an interesting discussion. It was interesting for people to be debating basic income so much. You can really see the progression over the course of the debates.
Yeah.
Which is and taking in Andrew Yang more seriously, and somebody else standing up for basic income that isn't Andrew Yang.
Yeah.
Even just framing it as like these are two options, basic income or jobs guarantee, feels really different from the first debate.
Yes.
It wasn't really that long ago.
Absolutely.
That's
Yep.
kind of fascinating.
Like
August
Four
or
June.
months ago.
June.
4 months.
Yeah.
Yeah. Things have changed.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
A lot. And I don't think he will win. I don't think he'll get the nomination. But I think that it's being kind of injected into the conversation is really great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That it's being
His
taken
defined victory is either he wins or he changes the conversation
Right.
so much that they start talking like him.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That's one too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And who knows, he might end up in some position in the government
Advising or
anyway,
something.
advising or, yeah, it'd be great.
Nick?
Yeah, I guess my mind is on this, kind of going back to that discussion earlier about the right messaging for like getting people to imagine, like to think bigger about like how big a change it would be, and to think of that as possible.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not just $1,000 a month, but
Right.
like a higher.
Isn't it not as focused on that because $1,000 a month isn't going to give them enough freedom to really
Yeah.
have a big choice of their lives.
Right.
So, and that's good actually, because if it were more, then people would be, then they'd really be facing the existential dilemma that we're talking about. And I don't know. if
It's a
you
potential
handle that.
downside, I think,
Yeah.
of having of Yang's role in the discussion is that he's really pegged it to $1,000.
Right.
Yeah, in a
Right.
way,
UBI,
it's too bad it can't just
broadly
be
discussed, means $1,000.
Right.
flexible, like the way Alex talks about it.
Right.
You know, that it's not, that it's to do with the production capacity of the economy, but,
Totally.
you know.
I think that's-
People like the
yeah.
idea of an amount probably better, simpler.
If anybody ever came along with Alex's point of view too, at least people have basic income on their mind, and then they could make the next
Right.
jump.
Yeah, they can make
Oh,
the next-
I definitely see
Yeah.
that. Canadian progress.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of a little launching pad.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, Richard?
Well, back in February, they had only 43% of Americans thought that basic income was a good idea, and then just last month it was raised up to 49%. And so basically, the thing's really changing people's perceptions about basic income, and 70% of college students think basic income is a good idea.
Wow.
And so-
Yeah.
Alright.
True. Yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
population that we would like.
Yeah, right.
Well, I think this is kind of the debate we've been waiting for, at least in this group, because
Yeah.
they really had like a whole conversation about
Right.
this stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, which hasn't happened to this point.
It's amazing, really.
It's fantastic.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. So I'm really excited to see where it goes from here. Curious to see what kind of content comes out of Andrew Yang spending 10 hours answering questions on Friday.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's going to be interesting from here on out.
Yeah. And will you post that, or where can I find that link to the online discussion?
Yang2020.com.
Okay.
To-
You could put it on
to the-
Boston. You
to
could
the-
put it on the
to
Boston.
the 10-hour thing, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sultan's on there. Thanks
Yeah.
for joining, Sultan.
Thanks guys on the live stream. Great
Thanks,
discussion.
Thanks, Tommy. Thanks, everyone else.
I think,
Yeah.
yeah, so next week we're going to be on Thursday because Bethany has another talk. It's not a TED Talk this time, but it's
No,
a talk.
just a baby talk.
Just
like,
a baby
not even
talk.
Baby talk?
but
Yeah. And next week we're going to be talking about moral foundations. So Steve and I
Good.
have been
Yeah.
arguing a lot about whether there's like a moral underpinning to basic income. So we're going to get into that. We had one on morality last year,
Yeah.
but we're going to get deeper into it this time.
Deeper into
Yeah.
morality.
So that's next Thursday. Thanks, guys.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Yeah, what are you talking on?
Oh,
Where are you talking?
what are we